Climate. London has a temperate oceanic climate. Rainfall records have been kept in the city since at least 1697, when records began at Kew. At Kew, the most rainfall in 1 month is 7.4 inches in November, 1755, and the least is 0 inches in both December, 1788, and July 1800. Mile End also had 0 inches in April, 1893. The wettest year on record is 1903, with a total fall of 38.1 inches, and the driest is 1921, with a total fall of 12.1 inches. The average annual precipitation amounts to about 600 millimeters, which is half the annual rainfall of New York City, but also lower than Rome, Lisbon, and Sydney, Australia. Despite its relatively low annual precipitation, London still receives 109.6 rainy days on the 1.0 mm threshold annually. However, London is vulnerable to climate change in the United Kingdom, and there is increasing concern among hydrological experts that London households may run out of water before 2050. Temperature extremes in London range from 38.1 degrees Celsius at Kew on the 10th of August 2003 down to 16.1 degrees Celsius at Northolt on the 1st of January, 1962. Records for atmospheric pressure have been kept at London since 1692. The highest pressure ever reported is 1049.8 millibars on the 20th of January, 2020. Summers are generally warm, sometimes hot. London's average July high is 23.5 degrees Celsius. On average each year, London experiences 31 days above 25 degrees Celsius and 4.2 days above 30.0 degrees Celsius. During the 2003 European heat wave, prolonged heat led to hundreds of heat-related deaths. There was also a previous spell of 15 consecutive days above 32.2 degrees Celsius in England in 1976, which also caused many heat-related deaths. A previous temperature of 37.8 degrees Celsius in August, 1911, at the Greenwich station was later disregarded as non-standard. Droughts can also, occasionally, be a problem, especially in summer, most recently in summer 2018, and with much drier than average conditions prevailing from May to December. However, the most consecutive days without rain was 73 days in the spring of 1893. Winters are generally cool with little temperature variation. Heavy snow is rare, but snow usually falls at least once each winter. Spring and autumn can be pleasant. As a large city, London has a considerable urban heat island effect, making the centre of London at times 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the suburbs and outskirts. This can be seen below when comparing London Heathrow, 15 miles west of London, with the London Weather Centre. See Climate of London for additional climate information. Religion. According to the 2011 census, the largest religious groupings were Christians, followed by those of no religion, Muslims, no response, Hindus, Jews, Sikhs, Buddhists and other. London has traditionally been Christian, and has a large number of churches, particularly in the City of London. The well-known St. Paul's Cathedral in the city and Southwark Cathedral south of the river are Anglican administrative centres, while the Archbishop of Canterbury, Principal Bishop of the Church of England and Worldwide Anglican Communion, has his main residence at Lambeth Palace in the London Borough of Lambeth. Important national and royal ceremonies are shown between St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey. The Abbey is not to be confused with nearby Westminster Cathedral, which is the largest Roman Catholic cathedral in England and Wales. Despite the prevalence of Anglican churches, observance is low within the denomination. Church attendance continues a long, steady decline, according to Church of England statistics. Notable mosques include the East London Mosque in Tower Hamlets, which is allowed to give the Islamic call to prayer through loudspeakers, the London Central Mosque on the edge of Regent's Park and the Beit al-Futuh of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. After the oil boom, increasing numbers of wealthy Middle Eastern Arab Muslims based themselves around Mayfair, Kensington and Knightsbridge in West London. There are large Bengali Muslim communities in the eastern boroughs of Tower Hamlets and Newham. Large Hindu communities are found in the northwestern boroughs of Harrow and Brent, the latter hosting what was until 2006, Europe's largest Hindu temple, Neasden Temple. London is also home to 44 Hindu temples, including the Baps Sri Swaminarayan Mandir London. There are Sikh communities in East and West London, particularly in Southall, home to one of the largest Sikh populations and the largest Sikh temple outside India. The majority of British Jews live in London, with notable Jewish communities in Stamford Hill, Stanmore, Golders Green, Finchley, Hampstead, Hendon and Edgware in North London. Bevis Marks Synagogue in the City of London is affiliated to London's historic Sephardic Jewish community. It is the only synagogue in Europe to have held regular services continually for over 300 years. Stanmore and Cannons Park Synagogue has the largest membership of any Orthodox synagogue in Europe, overtaking Ilford Synagogue in 1998. The London Jewish Forum was set up in 2006 in response to the growing significance of devolved London government. Bus. London's bus network runs 24 hours a day with about 9,300 vehicles, over 675 bus routes and about 19,000 bus stops. In 2019-20 the network had over 2 billion commuter trips per year. Since 2010 an average of £1.2 billion is taken in revenue each year. London has one of the largest wheelchair-accessible networks in the world and from the third quarter of 2007, became more accessible to hearing and visually impaired passengers as audiovisual announcements were introduced. London's coach hub is Victoria Coach Station, an Art Deco building opened in 1932. The coach station was initially run by a group of coach companies under the name of London Coastal Coaches. However, in 1970 the service and station were included in the nationalisation of the country's coach services, becoming part of the National Bus Company. In 1988, the coach station was purchased by London Transport, which then became Transport for London. Victoria Coach Station has over 14 million passengers a year and provides services across the UK and continental Europe. London has a modern tram network, known as Tramlink, centred on Croydon in South London. The network has 39 stops and 4 routes, and carried 28 million people in 2013. Since June 2008, Transport for London has completely owned and operated Tramlink. Economy. London's gross regional product in 2019 was £503 billion, around a quarter of UK GDP. London has 5 major business districts: the City, Westminster, Canary Wharf, Camden and Amp, Islington and Lambeth and Amp, Southwark. One way to get an idea of their relative importance is to look at relative amounts of office space. Greater London had 27 million square metres of office space in 2001, and the City contains the most space, with 8 million square metres of office space. London has some of the highest real estate prices in the world. London is the world's most expensive office market according to World Property Journal report. As of 2015 the residential property in London is worth $2.2 trillion, the same value as that of Brazil's annual GDP. The city has the highest property prices of any European city according to the Office for National Statistics and the European Office of Statistics. On average the price per square metre in central London is €24,252. This is higher than the property prices in other European capital cities: Berlin €3,306, Rome €6,188 and Paris €11,229. History. Prehistory. In 1993, remains of a Bronze Age bridge were found on the south foreshore upstream from Vauxhall Bridge. This either crossed the Thames or reached a now lost island in it. 2 of the timbers were radiocarbon dated to 1750 to 1285 BCE. In 2010, foundations of a large timber structure, dated to 4800 to 4500 BCE, were found on the Thames's south foreshore downstream from Vauxhall Bridge. The function of the Mesolithic structure is unclear. Both structures are on the south bank of the Thames, where the now underground river Ifra flows into the Thames. Roman London. Despite the evidence of scattered Brythonic settlements in the area, the first major settlement was founded by the Romans about 4 years after the invasion of 43 AD. This only lasted until about 61 AD, when the Iceni tribe led by Queen Boudicca stormed it and burnt it to the ground. The next planned incarnation of Londinium prospered, superseding Colchester as capital of the Roman province of Britannia in 100. At its height in the 2nd century, Roman London had a population of about 60,000. Anglo-Saxon and Viking period London. With the early 5th century collapse of Roman rule, London ceased to be a capital and the walled city of Londinium was effectively abandoned, although Roman civilization continued around St. Martin in the Fields until about 450. From about 500, an Anglo-Saxon settlement known as Londonwick developed slightly west of the old Roman city. By about 680 the city had become a major port again, but there is little evidence of large-scale production. From the 820s repeated Viking assaults brought decline. 3 are recorded, those in 851 and 886 succeeded, while the last, in 994, was rebuffed. The Vikings applied Danelaw over much of eastern and northern England, its boundary running roughly from London to Chester as an area of political and geographical control imposed by the Viking incursions formally agreed by the Danish warlord, Guthrum and the West Saxon king Alfred the Great in 886. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Alfred refounded London in 886. Archaeological research shows this involved abandonment of Londonwick and a revival of life and trade within the old Roman walls. London then grew slowly until a dramatic increase in about 950. By the 11th century, London was clearly the largest town in England. Westminster Abbey, rebuilt in Romanesque style by King Edward the Confessor, was one of the grandest churches in Europe. Winchester had been the capital of Anglo-Saxon England, but from this time London became the main forum for foreign traders and the base for defense in time of war. In the view of Frank Stenton, it had the resources, and it was rapidly developing the dignity and the political self-consciousness appropriate to a national capital. Middle Ages. After winning the Battle of Hastings, William, Duke of Normandy was crowned King of England in newly completed Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. William built the Tower of London, the first of many such in England rebuilt in stone in the southeastern corner of the city, to intimidate the inhabitants. In 1097, William II began building Westminster Hall, close by the abbey of the same name. It became the basis of a new Palace of Westminster. In the 12th century, the institutions of central government, which had hitherto followed the Royal English court around the country, grew in size and sophistication and became increasingly fixed, for most purposes at Westminster, although the royal treasury, having been moved from Winchester, came to rest in the Tower. While the city of Westminster developed into a true governmental capital, its distinct neighbour, the City of London, remained England's largest city and principal commercial centre and flourished under its own unique administration, the Corporation of London. In 1100, its population was some 18,000, by 1300 it had grown to nearly 100,000. Disaster struck in the form of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, when London lost nearly a third of its population. London was the focus of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. London was also a centre of England's Jewish population before their expulsion by Edward I in 1290. Violence against Jews occurred in 1190, when it was rumoured that the new king had ordered their massacre after they had presented themselves at his coronation. In 1264 during the Second Barons' War, Simon de Montfort's rebels killed 500 Jews while attempting to seize records of deaths. Early Modern. During the Tudor period the Reformation produced a gradual shift to Protestantism. Much of London property passed from church to private ownership, which accelerated trade and business in the city. In 1475, the Hanseatic League set up a main trading base of England in London, called the Stallhof or Steelyard. It remained until 1853, when the Hanseatic cities of Lübeck, Bremen and Hamburg sold the property to Southeastern Railway. Woolen cloth was shipped undyed and undressed from 14th–15th century London to the nearby shores of the Low Countries, where it was considered indispensable. Yet English maritime enterprise hardly reached beyond the seas of northwest Europe. The commercial route to Italy and the Mediterranean was normally through Antwerp and over the Alps. Any ships passing through the Strait of Gibraltar to or from England were likely to be Italian or Ragusan. The reopening of the Netherlands to English shipping in January, 1565, sped a burst of commercial activity. The Royal Exchange was founded. Mercantilism grew and monopoly traders such as the East India Company were founded as trade expanded to the New World. London became the main North Sea port, with migrants arriving from England and abroad. The population rose from about 50,000 in 1530 to about 225,000 in 1605. In the 16th century, William Shakespeare and his contemporaries lived in London during the English Renaissance in theatre. Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was constructed in 1599 in Southwark. Stage performances came to a halt in London when Puritan authorities shut down the theatres in the 1640s and 1650s. The ban on theatre was lifted during the Restoration in 1660, and London's oldest operating theatre, Drury Lane, opened in 1663 in what is now the West End Theatre District. By the end of the Tudor period in 1603, London was still compact. There was an assassination attempt on James I in Westminster, in the Gunpowder Plot of the 5th of November 1605. In 1637, the government of Charles I attempted to reform administration in the London area. This called for the corporation of the city to extend its jurisdiction and administration over expanding areas around the city. Fearing an attempt by the Crown to diminish the liberties of London, coupled with a lack of interest in administering these additional areas or concern by city guilds of having to share power, caused the corporations the Great Refusal, a decision which largely continues to account for the unique governmental status of the city. In the English Civil War, the majority of Londoners supported the parliamentary cause. After an initial advance by the Royalists in 1642, culminating in the battles of Brentford and Tenham Green, London was surrounded by a defensive perimeter wall known as the Lines of Communication. The lines were built by up to 20,000 people, and were completed in under 2 months. The fortifications failed their only test when the new model army entered London in 1647, and they were levelled by Parliament the same year. London was plagued by disease in the early 17th century, culminating in the Great Plague of 1665 to 1666, which killed up to 100,000 people, or a fifth of the population. The Great Fire of London broke out in 1666 in Pudding Lane in the city and quickly swept through the wooden buildings. Rebuilding took over 10 years and was supervised by polymath Robert Hooke as surveyor for the City of London. In 1708, Christopher Wren's masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral, was completed. During the Georgian era, new districts such as Mayfair were formed in the west. New bridges over the Thames encouraged development in South London. In the east, the Port of London expanded downstream. London's development as an international financial centre matured for much of the 18th century. In 1762, George III acquired Buckingham House, which was enlarged over the next 75 years. During the 18th century, London was said to be dogged by crime, and the Bow Street Runners were established in 1750 as a professional police force. A total of more than 200 offences were punishable by death, including petty theft. Epidemics during the 1720s and 30s saw most children born in the city die before reaching their 5th birthday. Coffee houses became a popular place to debate ideas, as growing literacy and development of the printing press made news widely available, with Fleet Street becoming the centre of the British press. The invasion of Amsterdam by Napoleonic armies led many financiers to relocate to London, and the first London International issue was arranged in 1817. Around the same time, the Royal Navy became the world's leading war fleet, acting as a major deterrent to potential economic adversaries. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 was specifically aimed at weakening Dutch economic power. London then overtook Amsterdam as the leading international financial centre. According to Samuel Johnson, "You find no man, at all intellectual, who is willing to leave London. No, sir, when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford." Late modern and contemporary. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, an unprecedented growth in urbanization took place, and the number of high streets rapidly grew. London was the world's largest city from about 1831 to 1925, with a population density of 325 per hectare. In addition to the growing number of stores selling goods such as Howding, Howell & Amp Company. On Pall Mall, a contender for the first department store, the streets had scores of street sellers loudly advertising their goods and services. London's overcrowded conditions led to cholera epidemics, claiming 14,000 lives in 1848, and 6,000 in 1866. Rising traffic congestion led to the creation of the world's first local urban rail network. The Metropolitan Board of Works oversaw infrastructure expansion in the capital and some surrounding counties. It was abolished in 1889 when the London County Council was created out of county areas surrounding the capital. From the early years of the 20th century onwards, Tea shops were found on high streets across London and the rest of Britain, with Lyons, who opened the first of their chain of tea shops in Piccadilly in 1894, leading the way. The tea rooms, such as the Criterion in Piccadilly, became a popular meeting place for women from the suffrage movement. The city was the target of many attacks during the suffragette bombing and arson campaign, between 1912 and 1914, which saw historic landmarks such as Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral bombed. London was bombed by the Germans in the First World War, and during the Second World War, the Blitz and other bombings by the German Luftwaffe killed over 30,000 Londoners, destroying large tracts of housing and other buildings across the city. The 1948 Summer Olympics were held at the original Wembley Stadium, while London was still recovering from the war. From the 1940s, London became home to many immigrants, primarily from Commonwealth countries such as Jamaica, India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, making London one of the most diverse cities in the world. In 1951, the Festival of Britain was held on the South Bank. The Great Smog of 1952 led to the Clean Air Act 1956, which ended the pea soup fogs for which London had been notorious. Starting mainly in the mid-1960s, London became a centre for worldwide youth culture, exemplified by the swinging London subculture associated with the King's Road, Chelsea and Carnaby Street. The role of trendsetter revived in the punk era. In 1965 London's political boundaries were expanded in response to the growth of the urban area and a new Greater London Council was created. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, London was hit in 1973 to bomb attacks by the Provisional Irish Republican Army, for 2 decades, starting with the Old Bailey bombing. Racial inequality was highlighted by the 1981 Brixton riot. Greater London's population declined in the decades after the Second World War, from an estimated peak of 8.6 million in 1939 to around 6.8 million in the 1980s. The principal ports for London moved downstream to Felixstowe and Tilbury, with the London Docklands area becoming a focus for regeneration, including the Canary Wharf development. This was born out of London's increasing role as an international financial centre in the 1980s.